Good morning, everyone, and I'm Sue Coffey, and I will be the moderator for this session. We're delighted to see you here today. Well, on behalf of the Cambodian Australian Federation, the Cambodian Association of Victoria, and the Cambodian Alliance for the Paris Peace Agreements, I'm very pleased to welcome you to this important discussion to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements on Cambodia. Signed by 19 governments, the Paris Peace Agreements ended 2 decades of violent conflict. They launched a process for national reconciliation and they paved the way for economic growth. They were indeed groundbreaking agreements. While much was achieved, however, much yet remains to be done, as many of the commitments have not been realised. Today, in this session, we want to discuss the impact of the agreements and also look at the issues that still exist with the Paris Peace Agreements, and specifically, therefore, to identify what can be done to fulfil their promise. We have a great group of speakers today to address these important questions. But just first, before I introduce the speaker who will open our forum, some housekeeping issues. We've muted your microphones and we'd ask you to keep them muted so as we want to hear our speakers. But do unmute them if you would like to comment at the question and answer session. And I'll also let you know that this event is being recorded. We have, as I said, an excellent panel of speakers, and I'd now like to introduce Garet Evans to open the forum. I know you all know him, but he's a man that needs no introduction, but even so he's getting one. Professor the Honourable Garet Evans, ACQC, was a Cabinet Minister throughout the Hawke Keating Labor governments, including as Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996, where he played a really central and very important role in the development and the passing of the signing of the Paris Peace Agreements. After a 21-year parliamentary career, he left politics and became the president of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group for 10 years and Chancellor of the Australian National University after that for another 10 years. He co-chaired many international commissions and has received a number of national and international awards. He's much published, including his most recently developing Good International Citizenship, The Case for Decency, which will be forthcoming in 2022. So welcome, Garet.
Well, thank you, Sue, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to you and Hong Lim and all those who've worked with you in the sponsoring organisations in putting together today's commemorative event. It really is hard to overemphasise the importance of the Paris Peace Agreement signed 30 years ago today. For years before, more than 2 decades, as the participants in this event will hardly need reminding, Cambodia had been on its knees, ravaged successively by massive US bombing during the Vietnam War, by civil war, by the Khmer Rouge's reign of terror, by invasion by the Vietnamese, and then by civil war again. Onslaughts, above all the horrific Khmer Rouge genocide, causing the deaths of some 2 million Cambodians by murder, starvation, disease, overwork, and effectively destroying the lives of a great many more. The 1991 Paris Accords did bring lasting peace to the country, and Australia, I think, can remain proud of the role that we played in making that happen. We initiated the diplomatic strategy that, after many previous failed attempts, finally worked. It was set out in detail in the Red Book, still widely remembered by Cambodians, which we prepared for the crucial Jakarta informal meeting of February 1990. And the strategy worked essentially by designing an unprecedentedly hands-on role for the United Nations during the proposed transition period, which gave China a face-saving way of withdrawing its support for the Khmer Rouge and thus fundamentally changing the dynamic of the whole conflict. Australians can also, I think, remain very proud of General John Sanderson's leadership of the UNTAC military mission during that critical 1991 to 93 transition period, which was crucial to its success. But as I said, when representing Australia as Foreign Minister at the Paris signing ceremony in 1991, peace and freedom are not prizes which once gained can never be lost. They must be won again each day. Their foundations must be sunk deep into the bedrock of political stability, economic prosperity, and above all, the observance of human rights. Sadly, the truth of that observation has been borne out repeatedly over the last 3 decades. We brought peace to Cambodia, and with it, some overdue national economic development. But as to democracy and human rights, the other 2 core elements of the Paris agreements, the record, we have to acknowledge, has been one of dismal failure. The rot set in early. The 1993 election itself was a brilliant success with 90% turnout. It was an incredibly moving experience. I'm sure a number of participants in this conference will recall, incredibly moving experience to watch those millions of voters lined up in their family groups, everyone from babies to grannies, lined up for hours at polling stations across the country, knowing there was a very real risk of bomb attacks from the Khmer Rouge, but nonetheless having so much joyful confidence in the future. But that election did not result in the expected win for Hun Sen and his governing Cambodian People's Party, CPP. He refused to accept the result, and the international community, far too meekly, I believe, in retrospect, allowed him to become joint prime minister. It was the last fully free and fair election Cambodia was to hold. Hun Sen's been clever and utterly ruthless. Within a short time, he'd vanquished his opponents, taken steps to ensure no opposition party could meaningfully contest his leadership. And over the years that have passed since, the CPP has become synonymous with corruption, with land evictions, control of judiciary, political repression, wide-scale arrests and imprisonment, physical threats to those protesting the loss of human rights, and on occasion, outright murder, as I called it out in an internationally syndicated article in 2014, which understandably enough enraged my former negotiating partner, Hun Sen. Over 30 years, moreover, Hun Sen has amassed vast fortunes for his family, including by siphoning off millions of dollars in aid contributed by the West. All this while almost 30% of Cambodians live barely above the poverty line, and a great many more survive on no more than around $3 a day, with COVID-19, of course, adding immensely to economic as well as social distress. On corruption, the World Bank ranks Cambodia's control of corruption as in the lowest 10% in the world. From time to time, hopes have been raised that maybe things were changing. In 2012, you'll remember, a wave of serious organised opposition began to develop, and the main opposition party, the CNRP, Cambodian National Rescue Party, almost won the 2013 election. But this was not an opportunity that Hun Sen would allow to be repeated. Repression intensified on multiple fronts, and with the 2018 general election looming, in late 2017, Hun Sen arrested the opposition CNRP leader, Kem Sokha, charged him with treason, and disbanded the party altogether. Thousands fled overseas. There are no fig leaves now left. Cambodia can't now be described as anything other than a dictatorship. So what can be done now? When it comes to the various relevant international organisations, I'm afraid my hopes are not very high. ASEAN remains hugely important for its role in maintaining peace among its historically very quarrelsome members. And as an organisation for economic and technical cooperation, it has its obvious uses and achievements. But it has shown itself to be completely incapable of maintaining any kind of discipline over its members when it comes to internal democracy and human rights issues, with Myanmar, of course, being just the most recent example, despite the recent appearance of a little bit of spine stiffening with the decline of the summit invitation to the junta leadership. I'm not sure that's going to make very much difference. Despite the efforts of successive UN rapporteurs on human rights in Cambodia, appointed pursuant to the Paris Peace Agreement, starting, of course, with Australia's very own Michael Kirby, my dear colleague and friend for many decades, who I'm delighted to be sharing this event with this morning. Despite those rapporteurs' efforts, it's been hard to energise the Human Rights Council, the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, to take any kind of effective action, let alone, of course, engage in this respect the much more powerful UN Security Council. Partly that's been a product of the protection that in recent years has been routinely given to Hun Sen's government by China. By far Cambodia's biggest investor, biggest creditor, Beijing treats Cambodia for all practical purposes as a wholly owned subsidiary, relying on its support to undermine ASEAN unanimity on issues important to China, like the South China Sea. I do know there continues to be support among Cambodian activists and supporters, which will no doubt be repeated by one or more of the speakers on this anniversary occasion today. I know there continues to be support for the reconvening of the Paris International Conference on Cambodia, as provided for in the 1991 agreements. But I'm afraid there's just no evidence support for this from any of the permanent 5 Security Council members, or really other key participants either, all of whom have, of course, multiple other current distractions. And the strongest steps that the conference could take, if it did meet again, would really be just to refer human rights concerns back to, as the agreements say, the competent organs of the United Nations, back, in other words, to the essentially impotent Human Rights Council. I believe the greatest hope for Cambodia's future lies with its own people, backed up with support and pressure, not so much from multilateral organizations, but individual countries genuinely committed to human rights and democracy and who are capable of exercising some influence. Cambodia's people, both at home and abroad, including here in Australia, of course, have shown extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of adversity. And whenever they've had the chance, they've shown that they want above all the restoration of decent governance. Within the country, with a median age of 25, its population the youngest of any Southeast Asian nation, the country does have wonderful potential, and younger generation leaders have continued to struggle against almost impossible odds to keep the flames of justice alight. The story of many of the country's brave human rights defenders, the founders of the first organizations in the early 1990s and those who've carried on the struggle since, is in fact superbly told, we should acknowledge today, in Sue Coffey's own book, Seeking Justice in Cambodia, which was published in 2018. And I want to congratulate Sue again now for all that she's done to keep the flame burning. It's really important that this story continue to be told and that its message of hope does get through to the next generation. Beyond their own resources and commitment, what the Cambodian people really need is external support, not just in the form of sympathetic resolutions from multilateral forums, but hard practical measures from individual countries that can put real pressure on Hun Sen and those around him to modify their behaviour. That pressure means, in particular, in the context of the next general election in 2023, pressure to reverse the ban on the main opposition party, pressure to enable the genuine exercise of universal civil and political rights across the whole community. Targeted individual sanctions against key regime members and their families, basically asset freezes and other financial restrictions and visa bans on travel, really do seem to be the most useful forms of such pressure. And after dragging its feet for years, the Australian government at last announced in August its intentions to enact a so-called Magnitsky Act to make easier the application of such sanctions in human rights and corruption cases, following US, UK and Canadian legislation, so named to honour the Russian dissident Magnitsky, who was tortured and killed after exposing government corruption there. It may be a triumph of hope over experience to believe that this legislation will be passed by the current Australian government anytime soon, or that it will be strong enough when it is passed, or that it will, when it's passed, be applied with any vigour. But when it is operational, and assuming it eventually will be, the Hun Sen government should be one of the first targets. Australia has been a world leader in the past in supporting the Cambodian people in their yearning for life and liberty. With their basic rights and freedoms now more imperiled than they've ever been since the end of the Khmer Rouge genocide, it really is time for our voice to be once again strongly heard. But at the end of the day, it's the voice of the Cambodian people, both at home and abroad, that will matter most. As I said in another forum organised by Hong Lim 3 years ago, the World Khmer Conference, everything I know about the pride, courage and resilience of the Cambodian people tells me that the overwhelming majority clearly want the restoration of decency and dignity in the way that they're governed, so that Cambodia will in fact at last become the country we all wanted it to be when we finally put to rest the ravages of genocide and civil war. I have enormous confidence that with the continuing commitment of so many Cambodians, including all of you participating in this event, that there will prevail that will for decency and dignity, for genuine democracy and genuine respect for human rights. So thank you, and I look forward very much to the rest of the discussion.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much, Garet, for that excellent talk, which gave us a very strong sense of the experience of preparing and signing the Paris Peace Agreements, the elation in the country as the first free and fair election came along. And you've also raised a subject that I think others will raise too today, and that is this issue of, can the Paris Peace Agreements in any way be resuscitated? So I'm sure we'll take that up as we go, and it might be a point to take up under the Q&A, which is coming soon. So thank you, Garet, very much indeed. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, who is Justice Michael Kirby. He has prepared a pre-record for us because he's not able to be here today, about which he was disappointed. But and also a man who doesn't need any introduction, I nonetheless will give him one. Justice Michael Kirby was appointed to the High Court of Australia in 1996 and served his term until 2009, when he retired. He's held many roles, including in the New South Wales Court of Appeal, the Australian Law Reform Commission, and many senior UN roles. His great interest in Cambodia was sparked by, as Garet referred to, his appointment as the first reporter on human rights for Cambodia, a role that was created by the Paris Peace Agreements. And he was appointed in 1993 and held that role to 1996. During that time, he sparred often with Hun Sen. I think it was described as the pebble in the shoe of, at that stage, the two joint prime ministers. But indeed, Hun Sen did not get on with him, and in a public outburst once said Michael was a crazy lawyer whom he had hated as long as he had known him. So on those words, we'll say, Michael, welcome Michael, and bring him up to speak.
I'm Michael Kirby.
Are you here?
And, I honour the
Yes, you can hear now.
of Cambodia. I'm here today because back in 1993 to 1996, I served as the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations for Human Rights in Cambodia. That position arose out of a clause in the Paris Peace Agreement of 1991. And it is the 30th anniversary of that agreement that we are meeting to celebrate, to reflect upon, and to consider what needs to be done to completely fulfill the objectives of peace and human rights and the rule of law that lay behind the Paris Peace Agreement. I pay respects to the King of Cambodia. I pay respects to the government and people of Cambodia. I pay respects also to people, including in Australia, who worked for the United Nations or who took part in the creation of the Office of the Special Representative for Human Rights. I think especially of my friend and colleague of many years ago, the Honourable Gareth Evans, QC, who was the Foreign Minister of Australia at the time and who played a key role in establishing the basis of the Paris Peace Agreement. And the Paris Peace Agreement had the essential idea that you could not create peace in a country as war-torn and as suffering as Cambodia was in 1990, 1991, without the foundations of universal human rights and the foundation of the rule of law. And so I was appointed to be the guardian of those great principles of the Charter of the United Nations. I didn't have an army. I didn't have blue helmets who could enforce my will. I had to seek the concurrence of those who had power in Cambodia, and that meant working very closely with the government of Cambodia and also with some wonderful people in the United Nations who worked in the Office of the United Nations in Cambodia. And my job was to report to the United Nations and the international community on the steps that were being taken to fulfill the objectives of the Paris Peace Agreement, and to do so with fairness, without belligerence, with courtesy, but with insistence upon respect for the universal principles of human rights laid down in the universal.
Yeah. Meng and Sinon, we seem to have lost the sound here.
Sorry, that's okay.
And the other great charters of human rights of the United Nations. The way I did my job was to go to Cambodia twice or three times a year during my service of 3 years, and to speak with government, with civil society, and with foreign missions and others living in Cambodia or working in Cambodia in order to test the water and to see what should be reported to the General Assembly and also to the then Human Rights Commission, meeting in Geneva.
This meeting is being recorded.
So my job was that of a reporter, of a friend, of someone who wasn't there just to attack every this and that, where the government had not fulfilled the obligations of the United Nations or the recommendations which I, as Special Representative to the Secretary General, had made. That wasn't my task. My task was to report on the good and the bad news, to report on the successes, but also on the failures. And the failures on the part of the government were a significant part of the report, but also the successes, mainly successes of the Cambodian people as they struggled after the Khmer Rouge period and sought to build a strong economy and a strong society that would respect the principles of human rights. There were undoubted achievements. I think one of the biggest achievements was the growth of the economy of Cambodia. Even in the years of 1993 to 1996, when I was Special Representative, there was a great flowering of the economy of Cambodia. And to some extent that has continued. It was necessary for me also to report on civil and political rights, because that's the other side of the coin. And the civil and political rights in Cambodia were often the areas where problems arose. And I believe they are still the areas where significant problems arose. Those problems included the issue of the treatment and equality of women, the issue of minority races in Cambodia, and particularly by the government of the day, the failure of the judiciary to enjoy the independence of government so that it will criticize government where that's necessary, and call attention to the disjunction between some aspects of the law made by the government and by the National Assembly and the universal principles of human rights. The interference in the freedom of the press and the capacity of press outlets to report adversely to the government, and the interference in the freedom of the electoral process. If you don't have a free and fair electoral process, then you're not going to have an effective and democratic National Assembly. It was in the political process that I struck most of the problems. The problems arose because of the removal of people from the National Assembly, and it arose from action by government to reduce the democratic features of the polity, to make sure that the National Assembly was representative of the true will of the Khmer people in the National Assembly of Cambodia. But unfortunately, the governments of Cambodia didn't like the bad news. They were quite happy to have the good news reported, but they didn't like the fact that I balanced the report with things that were going wrong. It became worse during the time when Hun Sen became the head of government and the Prime Minister of Cambodia. And the point was reached where he would not speak to me. And I enjoined the Secretary General to send his top representative to come to Cambodia to persuade him to restore conversations and dialogue so that we would get to the bottom of the issues and bring them to the notice of the United Nations, and where necessary raise money to help Cambodia to reach the goals that were set by the great charters of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All of these things were done. And for a short time, Hun Sen did agree to meet me again and to converse with me, but that didn't last long, and soon he was not speaking to me again. No speaks is the way children deal with each other. It's not the way that democratically elected governments deal with the high officers of the United Nations. And I made these points over and over again, but to no avail. And in the end, I reported to the United Nations, to the Secretary General and my colleagues in the United Nations, that I was not being able to get through to the government of Hun Sen, and they should start to consider a new appointee as the special representative. They did this, and they appointed a number of special representatives who succeeded me. One by one, they performed their duty, and one by one, they suffered much the same fate. And so, as we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Accords, which contained the clause that led to the creation of the special representative of the Secretary General for Human Rights in Cambodia, and as we reflect on some good news from Cambodia, but also some news that needs to be improved, and as we reflect upon the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that every human being has fundamental human rights. This is not something that belongs to government. It's not something that government gives to human beings. It's something that is inherent in being a human being. As we think of the achievements and the failings, our duty is to renew the commitment of the Paris Peace Agreement, the commitment to the people of Cambodia, the commitment to universal human rights for Cambodia. You can't have long-term economic success and long-term institutions without strong and independent courts, without strong and independent legislatures, National Assembly, and without free and democratic media that bring the truth to the people. And I extend my best wishes and felicitations on the 30th anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreement. Long live the people of Cambodia.
Well, that was an excellent message from Michael. And I think that one of the very interesting things I found in that talk is just how difficult it was from even the earliest days to get on with Hun Sen. And the fact that in the end, Michael judged it was not going to be a longer successful appointment. Many of the subsequent rapporteurs have run out 6 years in the job, but he obviously had a very difficult relationship with Hun Sen. And I think it's interesting to find that Hun Sen was so difficult in those very early days. Hun Sen did not want the Paris Peace Agreement at all, and certainly, as we can see, did not want to take advice from people such as Michael. So he's also right, of course, in pointing out that you cannot have strong institutions, strong business, and strong executive unless you have human rights observed throughout the country. So I think it's a very interesting set of messages that he's given us today. I'd now like to go on and introduce our third speaker today, Julian Hill. Julian Hill was elected as the member for Bruce in the Australian Parliament in July 2016. He holds several major roles in parliamentary committees, and his electorate is home to many of the Victorian Cambodian diaspora. He was previously a councillor and mayor at Port Phillip Council before holding a number of senior positions within the Victorian Public Service in a wide range of fields. Welcome, Julian.
Thanks so much. And I'm really sorry, I've been having a little bit of a look through and seeing all the friends and people online. I'm sorry that we can't be together, although perhaps on the positive side, it does allow a wider group of people to participate in the commemoration, both here in Australia, and I know we're recording and broadcasting this, so over time, perhaps elsewhere in the world. I'll just acknowledge the President of the Cambodian Australian Federation, Hong Lim, the President of the Cambodian Association of Victoria, Yuhorn Chia, my friend Meng Heng Tak. I think now, following Hong Lim, you're the second Cambodian-born Member of Parliament in Australian or indeed a democratic parliament. And of course, our eminent friends, Gareth Evans and the virtual Michael Kirby, as well as all the other activists who I can see there. I won't go through and name everyone, and people in Cambodia who may be listening now or in the coming days. I want to thank Gareth and Michael at the outset for their insightful reflections 30 years on today from the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, which did bring together the 4 combatant Cambodian factions and 19 other countries. Just a few words though on Gareth in particular, and to acknowledge at the outset his pivotal role in bringing peace to Cambodia is, I think it's fair to say, the key architect and driver of the peace accords. And yes, of course, as these things are, it was a collaborative effort. Many nations, many players in Australia and a lot of support, but none of us should ever underestimate the critical role that leaders play, like Gareth. We've seen in recent years under this government, that without firm, determined political leadership, the default state of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and our diplomatic architecture, and indeed most government agencies, the default state is usually inertia. We've seen DFAT be cautious and reactive, never wanting to upset anyone, maintaining dialogue at all times, incremental progress, and that certainly has a place. It may indeed be the day-to-day business as usual for skilled diplomats, but moments of real change and achievements like the Paris Peace Accord require political leadership to intervene, to shape, to demand real results. And against all odds, Gareth didn't give up. There were a few setbacks along the way, as I read in your book in great detail, but you pushed through. And I think Australia can indeed be proud of the role that our nation played in a period of wonderfully activist foreign policy, where we didn't just sit by passively in the world. We had agency and we went out and had a crack. We didn't achieve everything we wanted, but we had a crack. And Australians today, looking back, can be equally proud, I think, to know that it was the work of a Labor government with a truly great Australian Foreign Minister 30 years on today. The Paris Peace Accords did have three objectives: peace, to end the cycles of violence, and they were cycles of violence that caused the death of more than 2 million people, to entrench at least a version of human rights and global norms in Cambodia, and democracy, that simple but most powerful right of people to choose their own government. An honest score, as we've heard, is that 1 out of 3 were achieved. The situation with respects to human rights and democracy is dire and getting worse, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But at the outset, we should acknowledge the profound achievement, at the very least, that bringing peace represented. A personal reflection: intellectually, I knew of the horrors of the Pol Pot genocide, but it wasn't until 2 years ago, in August 2019, that the true scale of the disruption and destruction and the unchecked violence and insanity of the Pol Pot period really sank in for me. And indeed the destructive role, the geopolitical overlay, the destructive role of many regional countries and foreign actors. It was in 2019, just on 2 years ago, that I visited Cambodia with my friend Ming Hing Tak. We visited the Genocide Museum, the killing fields. It was the first time that Heng had been to those places, and I was privileged to be there with him. It was an emotional time. We talked not just of what had happened as we walked around, but also the dignity of the survivors of that period, so many of whom are in Australia. They don't talk of that period much, some never at all. But we should never underestimate, and today I think acknowledge and celebrate the success that the peace accords represented. We shouldn't gloss over the achievement of peace whilst we reflect sadly about the state of democracy and human rights. But while there, we did meet with human rights organisations, independent trade unions, victims of the regime and community leaders. And what we both saw truly shocked us. I've spoken in other forums about the destruction of Sihanoukville through Chinese investment. I won't repeat that now. I think I said at that stage it was probably the worst place that I'd ever been. What once was a beautiful place, it's been destroyed through Hun Sen giving away sovereignty to China. The appalling deterioration in human rights situation is well documented. Michael Kirby touched on the history of that, but these days through Human Rights Watch and the poor bunny that is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights today. But we saw it firsthand. We met with trade union groups and NGOs, draconian new laws that undermined their rights, restricting freedom of assembly and the ability of people to organise. And it's got worse through COVID. Like many authoritarian dictators, this gangster regime has used the cover of COVID to seize more power. We sat in villages and fields and met with poor families whose land has been stolen by Hun Sen. We met covertly, subversively, with government critics and democracy activists. We met with the inspiring Kem Lay when he was in Melbourne, Dr. Kem Lay, who was murdered for simply speaking up in support of democracy. Someone said to me, the government killed the chicken to scare the monkeys. Street protests are effectively banned now. Ordinary citizens harassed by the police just for speaking up on social media and sharing a view. Human rights organisations were genuinely fearful, and the workers there doing that work still are so brave, but they pleaded with all of us to keep speaking up about what's happening. But the state of democracy in Cambodia is worse than you can imagine. The opposition party, as we've heard, it was dissolved before the last election. Hun Sen won 125 seats out of 125 seats. I mean, you know, even I don't think we should win 125 seats. I'd like to have a few more seats in the parliament for the Labor Party, but we don't need 125. That's not a functioning democracy. But as some wise insiders observed, it's not really a one-party state. It's a one-family state. And Hun Sen is establishing himself as Southeast Asia's Robert Mugabe. But one of the big things that has shifted in the last 10 to 20 years certainly is the impact of Chinese influence. And I try to have a nuanced view on China. I was chair for some years of the Parliamentary Friends of China, but I don't see what Hun Sen has let China do in Cambodia as positive. He sold out his country's sovereignty such that China treats Cambodia as a client state, and in return, Hun Sen gets political support for his gangster regime. That's globally, certainly the diplomatic cover in the United Nations, but also, as we heard, through technology transfer, surveillance transfer, holus-bolus bits of the authoritarian model are being exported, and indeed even shutting down the trade union movement, one of the probably the largest democratic actor in society with the ability to mobilise people. And so they've started importing the Chinese model of trade unions, government-run trade unions, which are clearly a nonsense. And so I don't believe it's in the interests, Australia's interests, for a peaceful, stable region to see Cambodia drift away from their historically neutral position, or at least stated neutrality, towards authoritarianism. And even factions in Hun Sen's government are upset by this, which does provide a clue about how we may influence over time. People talk despairingly of the takeover of independent media outlets taken down or taken over by government cronies. But so the question for Australian countries that promised in 1991 to support peace and democracy is what, if anything, can be done. And of course, we have to be honest, Australia's influence is limited. But when visiting Cambodia, the question I probably badgered everyone with in talking with them is, well, what can countries like Australia do to help? Realistically, given the reality of the situation and the battles that you're fighting, what can we do to help? And there were many answers, but my conclusion was that ultimately democracy and a change in Cambodia's political situation can only come from the Cambodian people, but there are critical things that those outside Cambodia can and must do to help, to give support, to give space for civil society to speak up. And I think, Sue, you captured much of that in that beautiful book with stories of more optimism perhaps than we often hear. But first, the first step to recovery is to know you have a problem, as they say. First, we need to be honest with ourselves in Australia and global partners and admit that the current approach is not working. We need to speak up in every way, in every forum, and tell the truth. Now, as I said at the outset, Australia's default diplomatic approach is to just keep talking with Hun Sen, but it's insufficient. You build diplomatic capital to achieve outcomes, yet Australia can't point to anything much in recent years except the most disgraceful refugee deal, which the current Prime Minister signed. And Hun Sen is playing the Australian government, the Morrison government. People explain to us, though, that hearing people in the global community, others outside Cambodia, speak up even today, gave them hope and courage. They share our stuff on social media. I was stunned to discover in some parts of Phnom Penh, I was a social media star, far more famous in my own electorate. But that international scrutiny moderated Hun Sen's worst excesses to at least allow some space for debate and civil society, keep the flame alive. But secondly, Australia can and should coordinate actions, including considering targeted sanctions, or I think we're now past considering, imposing targeted sanctions against key members of the Hun Sen regime involved in human rights abuses and suppression of democracy, as the USA has done. Hun Sen's cronies, and they don't want their assets and wealthy lifestyles in Western countries threatened for them or their children. Visa bans and asset freezes would have an impact. And Australia has really direct ties, including in my electorate, I'm ashamed to say, in parts of southeast Melbourne, as has been documented, really direct ties to key members of the regime. The government could do this now, or they could hurry up and pass the Magnitsky laws. There are many other things I won't dwell on in detail. Getting back in the information game, using Radio Australia, Radio Free Asia, getting back into shortwave radio, being more sophisticated on social media, more public diplomacy. We still have a lot of soft power in Cambodia, and we should use it. More people-to-people diplomacy, that's cheap. Some more targeted diplomatic and aid efforts, and they will never be the centre of focus in Cambodia, but we can work with other partners. And pushing back, as I think we're starting to do, on foreign interference in Australia by the CPP to protect the Australian and Cambodian community from their propaganda and threats and preserve their ability to speak up in support of our values. But the final question I'll just address briefly is whether there's any continuing role for the 1991 Paris peace agreements. Now, Hun Sen, of course, in the last couple of years has been desperately trying to erase the Paris peace agreements from history, describing them as a ghost. He abolished the public holiday recently that was there for many years to commemorate their signing. And in a moment of what you might describe as peak irony, he described the agreements as an example of foreign interference, all the while he's selling Cambodia's coastline and sovereignty to China. But the agreements are of continuing moral and legal relevance at the very least. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights stated only a decade ago that the agreements will remain relevant until their vision is a reality for all Cambodians. And as we know, the agreements contain a formal mechanism, Article 29, to bring together countries in the event of serious human rights violations. And many would say that it's way past time that this clause was triggered, because there's no doubt that the threshold test has been met of serious violations. Now, any signatory, including Australia, could write to the UN Secretary General and other signatories to trigger Article 29. Now, I accept Garet's realist view that without stronger interest by major world powers in Article 29, it would be of little ultimate utility. The Human Rights Council is broken, and as we know, China will provide that diplomatic cover within the UN architecture. But I do believe it's worth formally considering, at the very least, a forum of the willing, if you like, to appropriate that phrase for good, perhaps, a forum of those countries willing to honour the promise that they made to the Cambodian people could highlight the situation. It would be interesting to see who did not turn up and at least coordinate pressure regarding these international actions, Magnitsky sanctions, and as Gareth rightly observed, the need to seriously increase diplomatic pressure on Hun Sen about enabling an opposition to participate in the next elections. And of course, through the historic agreement, Australia and the world made a promise to the Cambodian people. It represented a promise, unfulfilled, to stand up for human rights, peace and democracy, but the world has failed to keep that promise. While Hun Sen's regime has attacked human rights, killed democracy, given away sovereignty and accumulated secret wealth overseas. So in conclusion, let's hope that the 30th anniversary generates some attention and action from interested governments. I'm not optimistic about our government taking further action at this time, but we must work, I believe, for a change of government at the election and to elect a Labor government that will reclaim Australia's proud legacy of activism on the world stage in support of our values of peace, human rights and democracy. And in closing, can I also warmly congratulate and acknowledge Cambodian Australians in particular. The contribution that you've made over many decades now to every facet of Australian life. You may be a small community, perhaps in numbers, but you've integrated and making your own contribution to Australia, but you've never forgot your homeland. And so many Cambodian Australians take great personal risk in speaking up for these values for human rights and democracy, as we're seeing, I know, in another conversation with the harassment of the diaspora. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this commemoration today. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Julian. And that was an excellent array of issues that you've raised. And I should let you know that Hun Sen has just printed a new note, which has a wonderful picture of him and Sihanouk sitting, shaking hands. And this is for the anniversary of the Paris Peace Agreements. And he's also holding a function, a major function, having abolished the holiday in the Peace Palace. So I think there's a lot of irony around that altogether. But you pointed out some very important issues here and painted a picture too of what Cambodia is like. That travelling to Sihanoukville, indeed, it is an absolute shock, certainly from when I was last there. The China issue is extremely important. And I also the issues of Paris Peace Agreements, which you've taken a slightly different angle on. And I think other panellists might too. So it will be good to pursue that discussion. So thank you very much, Julian. It's excellent. And I think now we might start our first Q&A to pick up on some of these issues, and we'll have another chance to talk again towards the end. But I'd invite all panel members to join in, and please, anyone in the audience who would like to make a comment, now is the time to unmute yourself and be able to speak to us with your issues for any member of the panel. And I might start that off by just taking up again this issue of the Paris Peace Agreements and how we might get these together and what kind of process that might be. But I'd perhaps first ask, and Gareth might know, is there any precedent for such a major international signing convention agreement? Is there a precedent previously somewhere for this to happen? And 30 years have gone by. Are these agreements ever revived with the same participants? Could even a quorum of those members be accepted as providing valid answers? But I guess looking at the process too, who would call this? The UN, probably. And even if we did manage to get together those participants, I'm not saying anything negative here because it's something that I would like to pursue too. But what would Hun Sen do? Would Hun Sen take any notice of it at all? Can he be forced to take any notice of it? So perhaps Gareth, others might have some views on that.
Well, thanks, Sue. I can't think of any other precedents. There's been plenty of big, large-scale signing ceremonies in the context of successful peace negotiations over the years, but I can't think of any that have had any longevity, past the signing itself. What is distinctive about the Paris Accords is that they do make the provision that Julian spelled out for resumed meeting when occasion demands, but occasion has been demanding for the last 30 years. And I've explored this periodically with Indonesian counterparts, French counterparts, the two co-chairs of the Paris conference, as well as in other conversations with other key players in the US, the UK, and elsewhere. And frankly, nowhere do I get the sense that anyone is prepared to give it the sense of urgency and priority and diplomatic commitment that would be involved in getting that group together again. And if it was brought together again, we would have the immediate problem of the role that China would play, which has been, I described it and Julian described it in even more detail. And China would obviously be a complete spoiler. Either they wouldn't turn up at all, or if they did turn up, they would obviously be very disruptive and would seek actively diplomatically to undermine its effectiveness. So I don't mind doing unproductive things as well as obviously productive things when it comes to human rights. I draw the line at doing counterproductive things, and sometimes noisy diplomacy can be counterproductive. But I think the worst that can be said about reconvening the Paris conference is that it would not be productive. But maybe it's worth keeping the flame alive and continuing to explore it. And certainly, if we have a Labor government, God hope next year, that's one of the things that Penny Wong would be prepared to do, just put out the feelers and test the water. But there's plenty of things that key countries can do, and that's where I would continue to place my emphasis. Individual countries with the capacity to exercise real pressure through visa bans and asset freezes and other financial constraints. I think obviously the key Western powers, all of whom are concerned, US, UK, France, Australia, New Zealand are concerned about what's going on in Cambodia. And if there's going to be heavy-duty diplomatic effort put in over the next period, my instinct would be to focus on coordinating between the major already sympathetic Western powers that are capable of exercising some pressure and doing that. I think it'd be terrific if Indonesia could come aboard, and Indonesia every now and again, shows signs of mojo and willingness to exercise a bit of leadership. I mean, their impatience with the completely static situation with ASEAN and Myanmar at the moment has become obvious, and they are putting some effort into revitalizing an effort there. But really, it's hard to think of them being prepared to invest real resources into this. I mean, the trouble is, when you don't have a genocidal scale crisis, you just have serious democratic human rights abuses. It's very hard to sort of energize a sense of urgency, not least in an international environment where so many other countries are descending back into authoritarian bad habits. So I fully understand that sense that we need to be seen to be doing something. We need to be exploring all avenues. It's just that on balance, and I'd love to hear Julian, say still more about this, because he's very articulate in advocating the case for at least initiating an exercise here. I think on balance, it's probably not worth the effort. The effort's better placed elsewhere. But nonetheless, I'd be happy to be persuaded otherwise, because the frustrations at the moment are so immense.
Yes. Thank you, Julian. Julian, would you like to add anything?
Just briefly, perhaps I'd tease out the distinction between hope and optimism. I think many of the things which there's broad and common agreement can or should be done within Australia, so visa bans, asset freezes, targeted sanctions, but of course those things are best done in coordination with more countries. Now, it's highly unlikely, to the point of it impossible in the foreseeable future, that ASEAN nations are going to drift into the sanctions area. They tend not to use them as diplomatic tools. But one of the messages meeting with human rights groups and indeed some other governments was a degree of frustration that Australia seems so passive and uncoordinated with our friends and allies. That was a really at times quite bitterly pointed piece of feedback sitting down meeting with human rights groups. It was a real sense of disappointment and feeling like Australia's voice had been abandoned their work. So I think the hopeful bit would be to at least explore whether the Peace Accords Article 29 could provide at least a vehicle for a bit more focus and breathing a bit of life into these things and getting a bit more coordination. Am I optimistic that it would happen? I have to say I tend to agree with Gareth, but just because you're not optimistic doesn't mean you don't hope and give something a crack.
Exactly. We have to keep fighting this good fight.
So can I just suggest we ask for a couple of voices from the Cambodian community, whether it's Hong or Meg, because there's an awful lot of Anglo faces lined up on this panel, and it's all about the Cambodian people, as we're all saying.
Absolutely. Would anyone any of our Cambodians like to come forward and give us their views about the Paris Peace Agreements? I do observe myself, even when I'm in Cambodia or watching online, there is a great deal of faith in Cambodians about the Paris Peace Agreement parties coming together again. And yet you've pointed out the real reservations about that happening. So do any of our Cambodian watchers today have views about this? Do they think it's possible? Would you like to unmute your phone and yourself and come forward now and talk about it?
Hello?
Yes. Hello.
Hi, my name is Borong Ross. I'm used to work in foreign affairs, and I was here to serve with Senator Garet even then. But I think the call for reconvening for the member of the signatory of the Paris Agreement to intervene, I think it's unrealistic. I think I don't think it's going to achieve anything. I mean, major power have more concern about other countries like Afghanistan, Syria, and I think although it'd be good to have it, but I think that's completely unrealistic, really. It's just pie in the sky. I think it's better to perhaps, like Senator Evans said, target sanction against the corrupt family, freeze the asset. Maybe even, I believe there are some even family member of the ruling elite studying in Australia. Stop them from doing that. Freeze the asset. I believe there are even some money here. Now, people from member of the elite buying property in Australia. We stop them from doing that. We stop them from coming. That might have some effect. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. I certainly think our own law enforcement agencies in Australia should be pursuing very hard the many acts, many illegal acts by the senior members of the government in Cambodia in Australia, and not least the intimidating of the Cambodian community in Australia too. Would anyone else like to speak on that issue? And then we might go to our next speaker, but is there another Cambodian in particular who has a view about whether these agreements could be reconvened or are other options better? No, not at this time, perhaps. Well, in that case, we might close this Q&A session. We have another one later.
So, sorry. It's Councillor Sophie Tan.
Hello, Sophie.
Yes, hi. I just want to thank Garet and Julian for today, Q&A and for your speech. It is a great opportunity for all the Cambodians to hear you all. So my question to Garet and Julian basically, obviously just to do with the next elections coming up in 2023. And we know, obviously, dictator Hun Sen will, you can't function this election if you're going to cover a whole 125 seats. So, I mean, there's no other opposition that can do anything. So in terms of Human Rights Council, in terms of the government that's outside, external, what can they do to at least input something that to work in as a fair election? That's my main question.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that's a $64 question, isn't it? I think the key thing is to not just flail about with external sanctions, but to be very targeted, not only in terms of the people and the nature of the remedies you're applying, but make very clear what you want. And the first thing you want is the unbanning of the key opposition parties and the release from detention of, those who would be active participants in the election. And the second thing you want is an absolute, commitment to enable freedom of assembly and free speech and free commentary in the context of that election. I mean, there's many, many other items on the human rights and agenda, many things we could concentrate on, but just to sort of make clear what the very precise focus of this action is, would send a message. I mean, I think that the 2023 election is just incredibly important. And there's also communal elections coming up before then, which are also going to be important. But really focus on the democracy part of the piece, because very hard to get contrary arguments from the wider international community, and it's the sort of issue in which you might be able to get more buy-in. But Julian might have some better ideas, as always.
No, I think full agreement with Gareth. The only thing that I'd add in thinking about how we target and how we influence, and again, it highlights the need for better coordination between the partners who do have limited bandwidth. There's a lot going on in the world, but if we get together with our friends and neighbours and partners, I think we can have more impact. And we need to be more surgical and thoughtful, probably need some better intelligence around how we actually impact and where the weak points in the regime are. I touched on that in my remarks earlier, but that was a very clear message. This is not really a one-party state. It's a one-family state. And the consequence of that are that there's many factions and there's many people who get worried about their own place and their own security, and they're not very happy with the notion of Hun Sen's son succeeding Hun Sen. So I think that there's the opportunity in the next few years is the whole succession thing. No one lives forever. The whole succession thing starts to come up, as to where we may also target sanctions in the weak point, where there may be people in the regime who actually do want to take a different direction, or at least provide some concessions and open things up a little. So I think that's something which we've never really, at least to my knowledge, explored properly. And the community, people on this Zoom, and many people would have insights into some of that internal politics and how the regime is actually held together with favours and threats and band-aid and sticky tape, as these things tend to be.
Very well made. Very well made.
Thank you, Dan. That was a very good point. And thank you, Sophie, for raising those issues. Well, at this point, we do have another Q&A coming up, but at this point, I'd like now to introduce our fourth speaker.
Hey, before you do that, Sue, we've got a couple of other hands up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I can't see those. Okay.
There's Nicole and Taehon, so perhaps we should give them a chance.
Absolutely, please. Yes, one of them come forward. I don't know why I can't see this on my screen, but
no, we got the hand up sign, which maybe not showing.
Okay.
We ask Taehon.
Yes, my name is Bov Eve. I'm from the United States of America. Okay. Could you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. My question, just to all the honorable speakers, is that short of reconvening the entire Paris Peace Agreement, Paris Peace Conference membership, is it possible for the co-chair of the conference, working with other countries, interested countries such as Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, for example, to commission a team to actually conduct a fair and impartial review of the implementation of the Paris Peace Agreement in 1991, whether or not or where they've been completed and successfully implemented, and where are the shortcomings, and what would be additional actions that could be taken by the international communities and Cambodia to fulfill all the commitments that were made through the Paris Peace Agreement.
Well, if I can respond, I think that's a very interesting idea, which I have not heard articulated before, but for it to take off would, of course, depend on there being willingness by France and Indonesia to pick up that particular ball. I could see France possibly being persuaded to do so. I am less confident that we could energize Indonesia in the present environment. I mean, Jokowi is not a particularly externally focused leader of the country and wants to sort of confine his engagements externally, fairly narrowly. Indonesia has got itself energized a little bit more on the Myanmar issue. But it's an issue that I think if we are going to do some diplomatic exploration in the period ahead, that's certainly a thought that could be raised. So thank you for the contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I can see that Nicole has a hand up too. Nicole?
Hi, thank you for calling on me. Some of the efforts that are going on in the United States recently is the creation of Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia to shine the spotlight on the violations of the Paris Peace Agreement. We're creating a commission similar to the one that was created for Burma, and try to push for how do you call it, very deep sanctions. Deep changes, not superficial changes. And one of the other things that we have been suggested is to have the foreign countries not declare ahead of time not to recognize the upcoming elections, since none of the conditions of free and fair elections will be met.
Julian, would you like to respond to that?
I think on the first point, the difficulty is the lack of the burning platform. I think Gareth talked before about the difficulty in gathering focus in the absence of a genocidal maniac. And I added the word maniac, to be fair there. And in the situation in Myanmar, the brazenness of the coup, an unconstitutional coup, clearly unconstitutional, combined with an outbreak of violence and the risk of descent into an urban civil warfare spilling over into the region, creates that necessity for focus of the international community. One of the things Hun Sen's been very clever at is keeping the level of his repression below the sort of unacceptable level from the international community, where people have no choice but to try and divert resources and focus. So that's my fear, that the Myanmar response at the moment, and remember the Myanmar response, I wouldn't describe it as going terribly well. It stopped the military regime from achieving full control on all of their objectives. But it certainly hasn't at this stage spurred a return to democratic rule and constitutional rule. So I fear that that's the missing ingredient at the moment, and it's sadly not something we would wish for, that we get to the point where those conditions are met, that there's that level of violence breaking out again in Cambodia. So I think probably the path forward is in the areas that we've already touched on. So that's probably the best response I can give to that at the moment.
Thank you, Julian. Well, I think there are a hand or two up still, but we will have an opportunity to ask questions and answers, or give answers. And so I would like now to move on to our next speaker, just so that we can keep somewhere near time. So thank you very much for the contributions so far, and a lot of very important and interesting issues have been raised. So our fourth speaker today, I'd like to welcome Elaine Pearson, is the Australia Director and founder of Human Rights Watch, based in Sydney. She works to influence Australia's foreign and domestic policies to give them a human rights dimension. Prior to joining Human Rights Watch, she worked for the United Nations and various NGOs in Bangkok, Hong Kong and London. She's widely published and holds advisory roles in many areas of human rights. Welcome, Elaine.
Thanks so much, Sue. I'd like to start by acknowledging I'm on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thanks so much for giving Human Rights Watch an opportunity to say a few words today and be a part of this really important discussion. 30 years ago, in October 1991, Cambodia's warring factions, including the Khmer Rouge, and 18 countries, including Australia, signed the Paris Peace Agreements. Yet 30 years later, as we all know, the country faces a grim reality of repression, and abuse. And since 2017, the only genuine opposition party has been banned, politicians, human rights activists, even Facebook critics are in prison, and independent media, which was one of the early successes of Paris, has been wiped out. We've seen hundreds of political killings over the last 3 decades that have gone unpunished, and far from a liberal democracy, Cambodia is actually, just as it was before Paris, a one-party state led exactly by the same person in power, Prime Minister Hun Sen. So I think on this anniversary, 30 years is actually not the most important number. It's 36 years that Hun Sen has been in power, and it's 42 years since the CPP has been in power, installed by Vietnam in 1979, almost as old as me. So there are at least 80 political prisoners that we know of in Cambodia right now, and that number is expected to increase the closer we move towards the elections in 2022 and 2023. Among those prisoners are youth activists, political opposition, journalists, and people who've criticized the government, including people who've criticized the COVID-19 response and the vaccine rollout on Cambodia's most popular social media platform, Facebook. The charges imposed against these individuals vary from incitement to conspiracy. Some are in prolonged pretrial detention, others have been convicted in unfair trials. And among them are more than 24 human rights defenders in prison. This includes a concerning number of environmental activists. Attacks against environmental activists have increased, especially since the start of the pandemic. The authorities often accuse activists of trying to use foreign funding to topple the government and incite social chaos, when in fact they are documenting the government's destruction of the environment and natural resources. And there are numerous cases filed against those affiliated with the environmental group Mother Nature. Most recently, another disturbing case before Cambodia's courts is the case of a 16-year-old boy with autism, who is the son of a former opposition member who is currently in jail. Now, this boy has been detained since June. He's accused of incitement and public insult. At trial, his defense lawyer twice requested that the boy's disability and support needs be evaluated. However, the court has refused both of those requests, and he remains in detention. The COVID-19 pandemic has also been a very convenient pretext for the government to expand its authoritarian rule by restricting civil and political rights and failing to protect the social and economic rights of marginalised groups. The government has adopted a new overly broad COVID-19 law, which allows for up to 20-year prison sentences for those who violate COVID-19 measures. We're also seeing increased online surveillance and new laws passed to monitor all internet activities, which will come into force early next year. And in 2021, we also saw how the authorities used the pandemic to further stifle press freedom by labelling independent reporting as fake news and imposing de facto bans on independent media. So I think, these are some of the current problems that Human Rights Watch is working on and documenting, but we're really here today to talk about what can be done to stop the rollback on human rights in Cambodia, and especially what people here in Australia who are concerned about the human rights situation can do, and how we can encourage the Australian government to take further action to protect the rights of Cambodians. So firstly, and this has already been alluded to by Garet and Julian, they've talked a bit about the need for targeted sanctions. It's really important that Australia adopts a targeted sanctions law so that those who commit serious human rights abuses and acts of corruption are not free to travel to Australia or to hide their wealth or assets here. Now, while the government has committed to amending the autonomous sanctions regime, progress towards this is extremely slow, and what the government proposes is quite limited. In fact, in the government's response to the parliamentary inquiry recommending a targeted sanctions law, the government said, well, we're only going to tinker with the existing autonomous sanctions regime, and we're only going to look at the violation of 3 rights: right to life, right to be free from slavery and forced labor, and the right to be free from torture and cruel and degrading treatment. Now, from our point of view, there are plenty of activities that should be sanctioned that are not included, and this is much narrower than the laws that we see in other countries. And so, we're seeing that Australia is already falling behind other like-minded countries by not having a proper targeted sanctions regime. The US, Canada, the UK, the EU, they all have targeted sanctions laws. And as others have said, will only be effective if we can work in unison with other like-minded governments. Second, there's already been a bit of discussion about, UN action. What we really need are strong UN resolutions on Cambodia that reflect the reality on the ground. And the most recent resolution that was adopted this month at the Human Rights Council by consensus is weak, and it does not accurately reflect the human rights deterioration in Cambodia. I think earlier there was a question about whether a commission of inquiry would be a way to go. My personal view is, look, we have a special rapporteur, we have this resolution that happens every 2 years. It's really important that we keep that, but that we ensure that it is strengthened. We know that the UN Special Rapporteur has another mandate for 2 years. And we have also seen that there will be another oral update by the Special Rapporteur in March next year at the Human Rights Council, which is ahead of the election period. So now's a really important time to ensure that the Special Rapporteur is armed with the facts so that the Special Rapporteur's update reflects the reality on the ground. It was also really disappointing to see during the negotiations for that resolution, only a handful of states from the Western group pushed for stronger language. And this was really the US, the UK, the EU, and Canada. Australia was not part of that group. Meanwhile, Cambodia and its allies, China, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Belarus, and the Philippines, they were arguing for more congratulatory language on Cambodia's achievements and less international scrutiny. So what we ended up with was this sort of compromise resolution, which, frankly, does not reflect the reality of the situation on the ground. Thirdly, there's also been a bit of talk about foreign interference, and I think it is really important that acts of foreign interference are reported to the Department of Home Affairs in Australia so that they can act. And this obviously includes any acts of harassment, surveillance, threats, or intimidation by foreign agents here in Australia, or also threats that are made to family members back home as a result of activities in Australia. Now, we know that this occurs, but it is also important that complaints are registered so that the government can, be encouraged to take further action. Fourthly, it's important that the Australian government speaks out more often in joint statements with like-minded governments on human rights abuses. Now, this is in addition to private representations on human rights. So, for instance, it would be great to see more joint statements to react to trials of political prisoners and condemning politically motivated prosecutions. And that includes the ongoing politically motivated prosecution of, former Australian MP Hong Lim. Public statements matter, so it's not enough for there to be, these private representations. They matter for accountability, for transparency, and for solidarity. And they show the Cambodian people what the Australian government thinks and cares about, especially when the Cambodian government is now exerting such control over the media. And we know that the Cambodian government has a long practice of seeking to manipulate bilateral meetings into expressions of support for the government. We all remember the photo of champagne with dictators, which went viral. So it's really important, actually, that at every bilateral engagement that Australia has with the Cambodian government, whether that is on trade, security, or development, that this is an opportunity to raise human rights concerns, and especially raise the profile of specific cases of concerns, cases of political prisoners. Fifth, we think that Australia should also look at stronger regulations in place for overseas supply chains of Australian companies that are trading in Cambodia. This doesn't just apply to the labour sector, but also to land disputes. Australia does have a Modern Slavery Act, but this is quite weak in terms of its enforcement powers. So a supply chain law or a regulation could be helpful in also holding private actors to account for their rights abuses abroad. And we're seeing right now in the EU is actually drafting supply chain legislation, and Germany has recently adopted such measures. Finally, given concerns about ongoing abuses by security forces and the lack of accountability for security forces that commit acts such as killing and torture, joint actions with the police and military should be limited, and there really needs to be very strict vetting for anyone who is travelling to Australia from Cambodia to ensure that they haven't been implicated in human rights violations. Again, this is an area where Australia really needs a specific legal provision like the US that would require the government to vet all foreign security personnel. So in the US, this is referred to as the Leahy Law. In Australia, we hear from the government that such vetting takes place, but it's on an ad hoc basis and there is no legal requirement for such vetting, which means that if the government determines that they have other reasons why it's important to bring someone over for training, human rights considerations may simply be sidelined or ignored. I think I'll leave it there because, we'd love to leave enough time for discussion at the end.
Thank you, Elaine, very much indeed. There were some excellent issues that you brought forward. That it's extremely interesting in terms of what can be done to try and protect the influx of political prisoners, the laws that Hun Sen is enacting that really are striking down. The Internet Gateway law, I know, is going to be exceptionally difficult for people to combat. But I'll move along because just so we can keep to time a bit. And I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Serena Lillywhite. Serena Lillywhite's the Chief Executive Officer at Transparency International Australia, an international organisation tasked with tackling bribery, corruption and money laundering. TI also has an office in Cambodia. Serena has had a 25-year career in responsible business conduct and is an experienced corporate accountability practitioner, researcher and advocate. Serena has worked on the social dimensions of international business, particularly governance, corruption and human rights in many sectors. She is widely published with several corporate accountability publications. So welcome, Serena.
Thank you very much, Sue, and Jimrit Sua. I'm joining you from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, Australia, as you know, and the land of the Kulin Nations. And I wish to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this event, and my thanks to the organisers, and also to the brilliant presentations of all the speakers who've come before me. A number of the issues of which I was going to raise, they've touched on, so I'll keep it short and go straight to some of the suggestions. And in thinking about preparing for this presentation, I was reminded that the last time I spoke at a commemoration of this important event was actually at the 25th anniversary when I was living and working in Phnom Penh, and ironically it was a very important public holiday on that particular occasion. I'm just going to focus on a couple of issues, particularly around corruption, money laundering, and what can be done in Australia in terms of legislative reform to tackle some of these issues, but also the role of the private sector. As of course many of you know, and we've heard, Cambodia is one of the most corruption-prone countries in the world. It scores just 21 out of 100 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, one of the most widely used indices of corruption. And in our region, it's only Afghanistan and North Korea that score lower than Cambodia across the Asia-Pacific region. And I think what's really emerging from what's been said this morning and the expertise on this panel is a recognition and indeed the need to recognise even more that corruption and human rights violations and environmental degradation go hand in hand. And of course, corruption is not a faceless crime, and it's most often, you know, the most marginalised, particularly women and Indigenous peoples, who are disproportionately impacted by corruption. And as we've heard just now from Elaine, we're seeing an even greater uptick, if that's at all possible, in the level of attacks and targeted attacks against environmental and particularly human rights and particularly environmental defenders, you know, not least being Mother Nature most recently. So moving straight into, I guess, what some of the actions and possible solutions could be, you know, noting that this is a really hard and tricky issue that we're all considering this morning. I think we are all in fierce agreement that internationally all 19 countries who signed the agreement must not stay silent. And indeed, they have a responsibility to revisit and reacquaint themselves with the terms and conditions of the Paris Peace Agreement and put pressure on the Cambodian government to return to a path of democracy and ensure, of course, free and peaceful elections. And as we've also heard, Australia doesn't have a great deal of sway. Let's kind of call it out. But nonetheless, there are those soft diplomacy approaches that need to be pursued, all of which should be done, in my view, with the intention of providing support to the people of Cambodia, to civil society organisations, journalists and businesses in Cambodia, so that they actually feel supported to peacefully advocating for the government to foster political reconciliation and hold those free and fair elections, and basically to build democratic governance. I think the point that we've sort of has emerged this morning too is just how important it is in any democracy, including Australia, to have a strong voice, a strong and vibrant civil society movement, so that civil society is able to hold power to account. And clearly, that's not the case in Cambodia at the moment, and indeed, that space for civil society is rapidly shrinking, and aided and abetted with the introduction of some very draconian laws, which have the intended purpose of effectively shutting down NGO voices. So moving to a couple of points I wanted to pick up on. So noting that as Julian said, Australia has limited influence in Cambodia. What can the Australian government do? And I really want to focus on this issue of money laundering. Australia has become the go-to destination for money laundering. In fact, our doors are wide open to dirty money, much of which is coming from Cambodia, either flowing directly into Australia or via transit or secondary countries. And one of the reasons why so much dirty money that is often the proceeds of crime and corruption, is ending up in the Australian property market, as Borong indicated, is that Australia's anti-money laundering laws are very, very weak. The law does not require real estate agents, accountants or lawyers to do any due diligence as to the source of that money, to ask questions as to whether or not that money may be the proceeds of crime or corruption, and the real estate agents, the accountants and lawyers are not required to report suspicious financial transactions to the financial regulator in Australia. So that means that effectively you can pay cash for property in Australia with no questions asked as to the source of that money. And we know that often properties are being bought, particularly in Melbourne and also in the Gold Coast, which are now often owned by the sons and daughters of the ruling elite, or indeed owned through effectively shell companies or sham companies that really are linked to the ruling elite in Cambodia. And so one of the really critical things that the Australian government can do is actually meet its international commitments, which are now 16 years overdue, to strengthen our anti-money laundering laws and comply with the recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force, which again goes to Julian's point around how we need a coordinated approach, not only in the region, but indeed with all those 40 countries that have signed on to the Financial Action Task Force principles. So the point is that with so much dirty money flowing into Australia and ending up in the property market, and much of it coming from Cambodia, the Australian agencies need to be doing much more to follow the money, to follow the trail of that dirty money, and to see exactly where it's coming from, whether or not it's connected to politically exposed persons and the ruling elite, and indeed what countries it may be transiting in or travelling through before it gets to Australia, as an intended way of actually hiding the source. And of course, you know, if there is better tracking of this dirty money, then that then allows some of the issues that have been raised before about, you know, the identification of dirty assets, seizing of those assets, the introduction of sanctions and so on. And of course, when assets are seized, then it needs to go further than that. There needs to then be compensation for those who have been impacted. So let's say, for example, there's been a land grab in Cambodia, which results in approvals being given for a mine to be opened up that may be linked to an Australian company. For those landowners, those communities who have been evicted from their land, they should be adequately compensated. The other thing Australia needs to do, which will help the people of Cambodia, is to introduce a public register of beneficial ownership. And we need to fix our corporate register laws, because the reality is it's just far too easy for anybody to register a company in Australia without any checks done as to who is the ultimate beneficiary, who even, you know, who really owns the company. And this can be done through the use of nominee directors. So, for example, someone from the ruling elite in Australia might want to establish a company in Australia that's not really a company, it's actually just a vehicle to launder dirty money. And instead of them doing that in their own name, which might be a little bit obvious, they will appoint a nominee director. And in Australia, there is no requirement for nominee directors to disclose who they're acting on behalf of. So again, we need to fix our corporate register laws, and we must introduce a public register of beneficial ownership, so we know who's really controlling and pulling the strings. The final point I wanted to make is related to the issue of what role can multinationals that operate in Cambodia play. And this, of course, includes Australian companies and indeed Australian companies who are involved in not just operating in a high corruption-prone country such as Cambodia, but they're also conducting business in corruption-prone sectors such as mining and infrastructure and construction. And so these companies that are operating in Australia, they also have a responsibility to uphold the principles of business and human rights as outlined in international standards such as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. But what does this mean in a practical sense? Well, companies, and let's say Australian companies that want to do business in Cambodia, they need to make it very clear that they will not pay bribes to secure approvals and permits and licenses for example, for a mining project to be approved. And they will not tolerate or turn a blind eye to violence, harassment and imprisonment of human rights and environmental defenders. And companies, Australian companies, need to also make clear that they want to uphold the principles of meaningful community consultation and consent, including the principles of free, prior and informed consent, to address those issues such as land grabs that we've talked about. So if Australian companies want to operate and do business in Cambodia, they need to champion business integrity and they need to champion the respect for human rights. And they need to be asking questions, particularly on if they're involved in agribusiness, mining or infrastructure. They need to be asking questions as to whether or not land grabs have been involved in that particular project. And that also flows through then to the role of the investor community. What role should Australian banks, financial institutions, superannuation funds, what are their responsibilities in terms of doing the sort of due diligence they should be doing to ask the right questions around links to crime and corruption, possible targeted attacks on human rights offenders. And of course, there has been the one high-profile case involving the role of the ANZ Bank in the so-called blood sugar case. And so there is a significant role for the investor community. And I agree with Elaine that by and large, much greater due diligence needs to be done by the Australian government and by companies operating in Australia. Elaine touched on the issue of supply chains, certainly not just in the garment sector, as she mentioned, but also to be thinking about what Australia needs to be doing, such as a number of other countries have done, where we're seeing increasingly countries introducing the requirement for mandatory business and human rights due diligence laws to be introduced. And that's something that is a long way off in Australia. So I might leave it at that, so there's time for questions too.
Thank you very much indeed, Serena. There were some fascinating thoughts, and that really gives us a good framework to go forward and discuss the issues that Australia should be addressing, to approve its own oversight and look at the way in which we do manage the corruption that's pouring into Australia from Cambodia too. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll now move to our final speaker, and we'll just move along as we're getting very close to time. So that is our next speaker is Mark Butler, who was elected as the Labor Member of Parliament for Port Adelaide and Hindmarsh in the Australian Parliament in 2007, and is the Shadow Minister for Health and Ageing. Mark served as Minister for Ageing and Australia's first Minister for Mental Health in the last Labor government. He has also held several other ministries and was elected as National President of the Australian Labor Party in 2015, and is now currently the Senior Vice President. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sue. It's really quite an honour to be invited to say a few words at this seminar, and I really enjoyed the previous contribution from Serena. I want to venture very quickly to say that I speak at this seminar not as the spokesperson for foreign affairs and not as a particular expert in this area, but someone who has become deeply engaged with the Cambodian Australian community in my own state of South Australia, particularly as the local MP, and really quite moved and mobilised to speak out as far as I possibly can, both in the Australian Parliament, the Australian media, and from time to time in the international media, about the shocking and frankly disheartening descent into authoritarianism that we've seen, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years in Cambodia. I want to pay real tribute to, well, particularly the South Australian, Cambodian, Australian community, but I know across the country, for the level of resolve that Cambodian Australians are showing in the face of the heartbreaking events that are happening in their homeland. They are mobilising, they are showing extraordinary courage, and they are advocating for what I think are very reasonable and realistic reactions and solutions at the Australian Parliament level. The local community in South Australia, with leaders like Sameth Lem, the South Australian president of the CNRP, have just been fantastic in informing us, in urging us to be more courageous, and to speak out about what is happening in Cambodia. And through that community, I've been able to sit down before his imprisonment with Mr. Kem Sokha, with his daughter Monavithya when she was here in Australia, with Musa Kaur, just an extraordinary woman, and Chris Bowen and I were able to attend Sam Rainsey's National Press Club address a little while ago too. So that level of engagement and information really lifts the ability for members of Parliament like myself, and I know Julian, to speak out as much as we possibly can. And I can tell you there is no fiercer advocate for the interests of freedom and democracy in Cambodia in the Australian Parliament than Julian Hill. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with him as a friend and colleague in the Labor opposition. The Cambodian Australian community has become such an important part of what I think is the most successful multicultural community on the face of the planet. They've built lives here. They've contributed enormously over the last 30 or 40 years ago to Australia, but understandably, like every diaspora community here in Australia, part of their heart remains in their homeland of Cambodia, and they rightly have been quite shocked by events, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years since the 2018 election, particularly around freedom and democracy, and corruption, as Serena outlined so articulately, and the abuse of human rights and the victimisation of a range of NGO movements, particularly in the environment sector, the media sector and such like. We've seen, as Serena outlined, Cambodia really plummet in the world's rankings around corruption, but also in the democracy index over the last 5 years, plummeting a number of places to become only one of 6 countries in the Asia region that are described by the Economist Democracy Index as authoritarian. And there's no doubt in my mind that that description is a completely accurate and apt one. But this conference is about where to from here. So again, I qualify these remarks by saying I'm not a particular expert in international affairs, and I don't speak for the Labor Party on foreign affairs. I speak for the Labor Party on health and ageing, which is a fair distance from that matter. Let me say a few things that I, and I'm sure Julian and a number of my other colleagues are particularly intent upon continuing to focus on and advocate about. The first is obviously the upcoming elections. As I understand it, voter registration is already open for the commune elections that are scheduled for the middle of next year as a lead into the national elections due in 2023. It is obviously hard to imagine how they are going to be able to be free and fair with the dissolution of the CNRP, the jailing of political leaders, the exile of so many others. But having said that, Australia, the Australian community, Australian leaders and members of parliament must be relentless in continuing to call for free and fair elections and for the reinstatement of a party like the CNRP as the major opposition party. We must also, as Serena just outlined so articulately, continue to speak out about every atrocity, and there are so many of them, but every atrocity committed by the Hun Sen regime. We have this saying here in Australia that the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And while that is a completely apt way in which I think to live your life as an individual, it should also be a way in which a state governs itself as part of the international community. So whether it is talking about the threats that Hun Sen made some time ago about violence against Australians, speaking out against that, whether it's the ongoing CPP intimidation against Cambodian Australians that the Cambodian Australian community in South Australia reports to me regularly, or whether it is about the hoarding of assets and wealth through poor money laundering arrangements here in Australia that Serena talked about, we must continue to call them out. We must continue to call them out. But we face an environment where the international community, and I'm sure others have spoken about this more articulately than I can, we face a situation where the international community is not united about calling out Hun Sen for his atrocities and his failure to implement the 30-year-old accord. We face a situation where Hun Sen's regime does continue to get support and succour from other major players, obviously, in the international community. So calling these things out, will we know from Hun Sen's history, not lead him to change? There needs to be action taken, and that's why for some time now, the Labor Party, as I'm sure Julian pointed out, has called for Australia to put in place I always have trouble with this word, Magnitsky-style legislation, as increasingly is happening around the democratic world. We called for that in July last year. There was a Senate inquiry, as you know, that led to a clear recommendation from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate to introduce bipartisan legislation of that type. And I want to again thank the Cambodian Australian community and the association for the extraordinary organising effort you undertook to put submissions and put evidence to the inquiry to make sure that the recommendations that came from that report were good. And we introduced a private members bill as the Labor Party in August this year to try and push this process along. Now, the government has assured us that their legislation will be presented before the end of the year. But the clock is ticking on that, to be frank. And although we have said, as the opposition and Penny Wong has said, that we are very keen to cooperate with the government on this and to make sure that this is a bipartisan effort, we can't sit back forever and wait for the government to act on something that has been a clear recommendation from a bipartisan committee now for coming up to 12 months. So this must be actual legislative mechanisms for us to take action against the regime, as Serena pointed out, against senior actors and family members of Hun Sen who are laundering money here. Real action that actually imposes a price for the atrocities continually being committed by the regime must be put in place by the Australian Parliament, as it must be by parliaments and congresses across the democratic world. I make the commitment to continue to be as strong an advocate as I possibly can for freedom and democracy in Cambodia. This is, I think, a very proud part of Australia's history over the last few decades, the role that the Australian government, particularly Garet, played along with the Cambodian Australian community in bringing together those peace accords. And 30 years on, a key element of those accords, a key promise around freedom and democracy is yet to be delivered. And if anything, over the last 4 or 5 years has looked ever more distant from being delivered than over the last 3 decades. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I've had to duck out of the state conference of the Labor Party here in South Australia to speak to you. So I'm going to have to leave you and go and participate in a debate about submarines policy. But can I just thank you for your courage, your advocacy and your level of organisation and the generosity of your time with members of Parliament like Julian and myself in making sure that we are as well informed as we possibly can be when we participate in these important national debates.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's extremely good to have you here. Thank you for making the time to duck out of submarines in the conference. And you raised some very interesting issues today too. A lot has come up, but thank you very much for attending. Okay, thank you. I think we might now, we've just got a little time before the end here this morning. That's all of our speakers, but we have some hands up. So I'd like now to take some hands and please appeal to our panelists to answer these questions, but I know some were there since the last Q&A. So we've got Tae Horn Nim. There we go. Would you like to come forward and provide your question and tell us where you're from?
Thank you so much, Sue. Well, I'm just a Cambodian ordinary people in Melbourne here, and love for an opportunity to take part of this. And thank you so much, the Honourable Garet Evans and everybody's here. It's nice to see on this 30 years anniversary of Paris peace agreement. The first thing I would like to say, just to make contribution to this in terms of and overall, is that we have a lot of wonderful speakers, respectable, honorable speakers, and a lot of ideas. But I think one of the things we need to look at it, how we look forward from here. Unfortunately, Australia, we're going to have election very soon, and it looked like the government, Australian government, wouldn't be able to do anything much from here because of the, inclination of the geopolitics in the region. You can see the Australian government take a strong lead in terms of the COVID investigation against China. You can see that how the sentiment come up in that. And I'm not quite sure how Australia can do. And I think that it's important that Cambodia is going to be the chairman of the ASEAN next year. And people now, as the Honourable Mark Butler mentioned about it, they already registered for next year election. And no main opposition leaders involved in this matter, and it's quite concerned. And I think it's important to take a strong action from the government, but how are we going to do that? And probably to quote my local member of parliament, Julian Hill, saying, we only get rid of the Scott Morrison, but it's a long way to go. But how we going to tackle this? I think maybe the Honorable Garet Evans can lead us a little bit of how we going to get into the Australian politics here, get Australian government to sort of stamp out in terms of corruption we're talking about, in terms of the geopolitics here, not to, I mean, they even send refugees back to Cambodia, this is ridiculous.
Yes.
So there's a lot of issue in here, and I think how we going to do that? And the other thing, I think maybe we could ask, Julian here, if Labour going to win for the election next year, or hopefully next year, what sort of the policy plan look forward in order to assist Cambodia?
Yes. Okay, I might stop you there, Tae-Hun Yim. We'll take an answer. Who would like to answer that among our panelists? Julian, are you there and would you like to speak?
Sure, I might address the last question in that case. Tae-Hun, good to see you. And first thing I'll say is I'm not going to sit here and make up Labor policy, because Penny Wong would find me and she'd deal with me, just to be very clear. But first and foremost, I think in terms of the practical immediate actions, it is a priority for an incoming Labor government to legislate the Magnitsky sanctions. I see no real prospect that will be done before the election. There's a remote possibility if the government surprised us all and introduced some legislation before Christmas, and it happened to be perfect legislation, which is highly unlikely that it could wave through in March if there was an election in May, but I think it's highly unlikely. So I think that's got to be a priority for an incoming Labor government. We've made it clear. We've even introduced draft bills to the Parliament and the Senate to make the point, which could be refined, but that's got to be a first priority. Penny has also outlined the importance that would be placed on our diplomatic relations with ASEAN and in particular Indonesia. Gareth mentioned a number of times the criticality, I think my word, but of Indonesia in ASEAN, but also in the region. And if we're to see a change in tone or increased pressure perhaps on Cambodia in the lead up to the elections, then I would think Indonesia is going to be a key player, whether that's done perhaps quietly or whether it's more overt. That would be something that Australia, with a Labor foreign minister, would be able to take up. The final point I'd make is also you can be sure that we won't be doing stupid refugee deals and so on and giving cheap propaganda victories to the Hun Sen regime. And, it sounds like a silly thing to say and an obvious thing to say, but I think it does need to be said, given that the mistakes that this government has made in allowing themselves to be used to further Hun Sen's authoritarian and propaganda kind of agendas. So I don't think I want to add anything else in particular, but I think that the big ticket item really is the targeted sanctions, and that would be a priority.
Thank you, Julian. And we'll go on. We've still got 3 hands up. Could I ask you to make your questions really succinct and short, because we really are just about out of time. So Sophia, would you like to ask?
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you. I'm Sophia from Cambodia. I have 8 questions to the panel discussion.
Yes.
If I'm not clear the question, you can ask in the inbox chat, because I already write there in 8 questions. My first question is that, can signatory country build Cambodian people on the foundation of PPA, since people are the owner of the country based on PPAs? Question number 2, can signatory country and international country support Cambodian people financially, technically, and any kind of support to let Cambodian people know how to demand their power rights based on the PPAs? Question number 3, how can Cambodian people lobby signatory and international committee to respect and responsible for their obligation in PPA, especially to ensure Cambodian constitutional law and never be changed against PPA and international law which protect political rights of Cambodian people. Question number 5.
I think, Sophia, we might need to stop after question number 5, please, because we're really out of time here.
Thank you. So, okay, thank you.
That's fine. Now, who would like to answer some of those questions on our panelists?
Just very quickly, I just sent in the chat actually a joint letter that Human Rights Watch, and I think it was like more than 50 other Cambodian and international human rights groups actually sent to the UN and France and Indonesia, and we CC'd all the Paris Peace Agreement foreign ministers. This was sent in 2017 because we were so concerned about, what happened and the outcome of the last election and the arrest of Kem Sokha and the, dismantling of the CNRP. We actually asked for an emergency summit at that time for those governments to convene on Cambodia. We didn't get that. So I think we need to look at sort of what we have got. There are opportunities coming up, things like, Biden is having this summit of democracies, December 9 and 10 around Human Rights Day. So I think looking at how we can address some of these issues where, there are all the sort of trappings of democracy, but the reality is obviously something very, very different. I think looking at how we can ensure that Cambodia is on the radar of those sort of bigger international discussions will be important going forward.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
So if I could just add too, with regards to the question around technical and financial support, I think this is I think it's really important that, for example, the Australian government does not shy away from strong support, financial support to non-government organisations in Cambodia. They need to be brave in not just supporting civil society organisations that work on issues such as education and health, which of course are very important, but they need to be willing to fund organisations such as environmental defenders and human rights defenders. And of course, this is in the against the context that Elaine mentioned, that they're up against some stiff competition with the government saying, well, this is a clear sign of ruling, undue influence through funding of NGOs. And I do think it's the Australian government does have a responsibility. One very practical way they can continue their support for the PPA is to not shy away generous and much greater provision of development assistance funding for non-government organisations in Cambodia, including a willingness to support NGO legal organisations, to give them effectively a fighting fund when there are these unprecedented numbers of imprisonment that Elaine mentioned. So I think that's a critical issue. We need to boost our overseas development assistance to the NGO sector in Cambodia.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Serena. Now, I'm afraid we have time for just one more question. So, Seng Ding Nong, would you like to speak? Okay, we'll move to perhaps.
Hello?
Yes, hello, Nat.
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. Sorry for my English very poor. Thank you.
That's fine. Could I just ask you keep your question very short because we are really out of time.
Okay. I want to know the Article 1 in the transitional period is expired or not. If not, why? If yes, why? Because someone is say the Paris Agreement is expired already now. In today is 30 years already. And Article 5 in the page 200 said my question in the chat, but now I maybe forget the article. Yes, in the page of PPA 254, Article 5, first, in the event of the violation or threat of violation of the sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and inviolability, neutrality, or national unity of Cambodia, or of any of the other commitment herent the parties to this any of other to this agreement undertake to console immediately with a view to adopting all appropriate steps to ensure respect to their commitment and resolving any such violation trust peacefully.
Do you have a question from this, Singh?
Yes, I think Sue, what Singh is saying, he's referring to the provisions of the Paris agreements, which create the possibility of re-establishing the conference and using that as the institutional vehicle for putting pressure back on the government. I think the points are very well made, but I think we've already, in a sense, addressed them by saying they haven't expired. They are still technically applicable, those provisions, but the big problem is political and getting the key parties energized. And if we did ever get the Paris participants meeting again, getting them to agree on anything other than just referring it back to UN organs, which have proved rather impotent. My own sort of final word on this is I think we've heard so many good specific proposals from Serena and from Elaine and from Julian, and about particularly focusing on these immediate legislative strategies and executive action that key committed governments can take. I honestly think for the community, rather than being wistful about recreating a new Paris conference, far better to devote your advocacy energies to getting some movement out of the governments that really can put some pressure on these characters. And that includes the Labour Party, which, with all respect to what Mark was saying, what Julian was saying, the Labour Party has been a little bit quiet on these issues and foreign policy issues generally, and they just really want them all to go away and focus on other things during the election. But the critical thing is to get that messaging into the Labour Party leadership that these are really important issues, and that if we do come back to government, expectations are very high that there'll be a bit of serious activism again and some serious focus on these very sharp strategies that our speakers have outlined.
Thank you, Garet. Look, thank you for all our questions too. I'm afraid I'm now going to have to draw this to a close as the next session is going to start soon. So on your behalf, I'd like very much to thank our speakers today, Gareth Evans, Julian Hill, Elaine Pearson, Serena Lillywhite, Mark Butler, and Michael Kirby, of course. And on your behalf, I'd like to thank them very much. And I'd also like to thank you very much for attending today. It has been a very interesting discussion with some very important points made. So thank you for coming. And I do hope that you found it both interesting and informative. I'd now like to bring a close to this extremely important forum, and I'd like to hand back to Hun Sen, who is waiting to begin the next section in Khmer. So thank you all, and I think it's been a wonderful forum. We'll take up these points later too. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, for your chairmanship. Much appreciated.
Thank you. So I'd now like to hand back to Hong Lim. It's a pleasure. I'm sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but I am over time quite a bit. So Hong Lim, are you there? I'd like to hand over to you now, or to Meng Hang Tek.
Yes, I'm here, and I apologize for not being able to get through at the beginning. Somehow, every time I click, I got onto 000 emergency number. But now I've been so impressed with the contribution of our speaker. I'd like to thank them again, and particularly thank Sue for your moderating, tremendously and very great. Look, I think, well, I hope that the other speaker who is still listening, I must take the opportunity to remind all of us that we are doing all this also in remembering and paying tribute to all the people who have suffered and who have sacrificed. Some of them made the ultimate sacrifice in fighting for human rights, fighting for freedom of speech. And and everything else. And many of them are now in prison. And I must note that and many other Khmer people, including several environmentalists, young activists, and other advocates who have spoken out against the harshly repressive abuse in Cambodia, are currently facing criminal charges or inciting treason for daring to be publicly critical of Hun Sen government. Many of these young people or young advocates still in Cambodia have been held in detention for over a year now on these patently false, politically motivated charges. Others, like myself, are being criminally prosecuted in absentia on a mass basis to force us into silence. It brings tears to my eye to think of the harsh treatment of those loyal young Khmer people who are receiving for doing nothing more than, in their own word before the court, exercising our free speech right protected under the Cambodian Constitution. And I now like to add that this is protected by the spirit of the Paris Peace Agreement, which we are talking about today. It is long past the time when the international community need to refuse to accept these unlawful practices and to demand justice and accountability from the Hun Sen government. I'd like to entreat you all to remember all that who are still in prison, and hopefully that things are improving for them with the critically COVID condition in the prison, and I know they're suffering very much. Well, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Hong.